The sun over the city of Crestview wasn't just shining. It was punishing. It baked the concrete sidewalks until they shimmered with wavering heat, and the air felt thick and heavy, like a warm, damp blanket. Everyone moved slowly, if they moved at all, seeking out any patch of shade they could find. On one such sidewalk, Officer Dale Brickman wiped a sleeve across his forehead. His uniform shirt was stuck to his back with sweat. He hated foot patrol, especially on a day like this. It was grunt work, beneath him in his opinion. He'd been on the force for 15 years, and he felt he'd earned the right to be in his air-conditioned squad car, not melting out here with the general public. He scanned the crowd with tired, irritated eyes. To him, the bustling people weren't individuals. They were a collection of potential problems, litterers, loiterers, noise dash makers. His gaze landed on the public fountain in the small park square. It was an old stone thing, with water trickling down its tiers. And there, sitting on its broad granite edge, was a girl. She looked to be in her late teens. She had her back to him, her dark hair in neat, intricate braids that fell down her back. Her feet were dipped in the fountain's bottom pool, and she was bent over a sketchbook in her lap, completely absorbed in her drawing. A hot spike of annoyance shot through Brickman. The sign right next to the fountain, though faded, clearly said, "No waiting." To him, this wasn't a kid trying to cool off. It was a blatant disregard for the rules. It was an eyesore. It was disrespect. And the fact that she was so calmly ignoring the world around her, as if she owned the spot, made it worse. He watched her for a full minute, his jaw tightening. A family with tourists' maps walked by, giving the girl a wide berth. A businessman in a wrinkled suit sighed as he stepped around her. In Brickman's mind, each of these people was judging not just the girl, but the entire police force for allowing this disorder. It was his job to correct it. He strode over, his boots making heavy, official sounds on the pavement. He stopped right behind her, casting a shadow over her sketchbook. She didn't look up. She just kept moving her pencil in smooth, confident lines. "You," he said, his voice a low growl. "Get your feet out of the water. This isn't your personal swimming hole." The girl finally paused her drawing. She tilted her head back slightly, looking up at him. Her face was young, but her eyes were strangely calm and observant. They took him in the sweaty, angry face, the badge, the tense posture. She didn't look scared. She looked curious. "I'm just cooling my feet," she said, her voice even and quiet. "The water's just running to the drain anyway." Her tone, so reasonable and unafraid, was like gasoline on the fire of his irritation. She was talking back. She was making excuses. "I don't care what you're just doing," Brickman snapped. "The sign says no waiting. That means you. Now." He expected immediate obedience. He expected her to scramble up, muttering an apology. Instead, she looked from him to the fountain, then back to her sketchbook. She slowly closed the book, but she didn't move her feet. It was a small, silent act of defiance. That was the final straw for Brickman. He needed to make a point. He needed to show her, and anyone watching, that you didn't ignore an officer's command. His eyes darted around. A tourist nearby, a man in a loud Hawaiian shirt, was just taking a long drink from a cold bottle of water. Without a second thought, Brickman stepped over, snatched the bottle right from the man's hand. The tourist spluttered in surprise. "Hey, what are you?" Brickman ignored him. He turned back to the girl. She was watching him now, fully. Her expression hadn't changed, but her body was still, like a cat watching a strange movement. "You want to cool off?" Brickman said, a nasty smirk twisting his lips. "Let me help you." He raised the plastic bottle, and in one deliberate motion, poured the entire contents of cold water directly over the top of her head. It was a shocking, ugly moment. The water splashed over her braids, streamed down her face and neck, soaking the shoulders of her simple t-shirt. It plastered her clothes to her skin and dripped onto the closed sketchbook in her lap. A few gasps came from people who had stopped to watch. The tourist whose water it was took a step back, looking horrified. Time seemed to freeze for a second. The girl sat perfectly still as the water dripped from her chin. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry out. She just blinked the water from her eyelashes and looked up at Officer Brickman. That calm, analytical look was still there, but now it had hardened into something else. Something cold and knowing. Brickman felt a tiny, brief pang of something, not guilt, but uncertainty. Her reaction was all wrong. Where were the tears? The shouted protests? This silence was unnerving. To cover his own unease, he crumpled the empty bottle and tossed it into a nearby trash can with a loud rattle. "Public property isn't your personal bathtub," he repeated, his voice louder now for the audience. "Consider that a lesson in following the rules. Now move along." For a long moment, she just looked at him. She looked at his nameplate. She looked at his badge number. She looked right into his eyes, and it felt like she was memorizing every detail of him. Then, without a single word, she slowly lifted her feet from the fountain. She stood up, water still dripping from her clothes. She tucked her damp sketchbook under her arm. "I said move along." Brickman barked, trying to regain full control of the situation. She turned and walked away. Not quickly, not in a scared run, but with a slow, deliberate pace. She didn't look back. She just walked down the sidewalk, turned the corner, and was gone. Brickman watched her go, then let out a short, scoffing breath. He shook his head. Just another disrespectful kid who thought the rules didn't apply to her. He'd shown her. He adjusted his belt, puffed out his chest a little, and nodded at the small, dispersing crowd as if to say, "Nothing to see here. Order has been restored." He pulled out his small notebook. Under incident, he scribbled, "Juvenile disturbance, public nuisance, advised and dispersed." He didn't write about the water. He didn't write about the snatched bottle. In his mind, it was a non-event. A small victory on a hot, frustrating day. He resumed his patrol, the image of the dripping, silent girl already fading from his mind, replaced by thoughts of his air-conditioned car and the end of his shift. He had no idea that every second of the encounter had been watched and recorded from 3 different angles. He had no idea that the cold water he'd poured wasn't just water. It was the beginning of an avalanche. The girl with the braids walked away from the fountain with that same deliberate, unhurried pace. She didn't look back, not even once. She turned the corner, and the moment she was out of Officer Brickman's sight, her pace changed. It didn't become a run, but it shifted into the quick, efficient stride of someone with a clear destination. She walked half a block down, past a coffee shop and a bank, to a plain-looking gray metal door set between 2 storefronts. There was no sign, just a small, sleek keypad. She punched in a code, the lock clicked, and she slipped inside, the door closing silently behind her. Inside, it was a different world. The oppressive heat vanished, replaced by the steady hum of air conditioning. The space was a small, tiled service corridor, lit by fluorescent lights. She walked past industrial pipes and electrical boxes to a freight elevator. She pressed a button, and the elevator descended, taking her down into the bedrock beneath the city. When the doors opened again, she stepped into a quiet, dimly lit room that buzzed with low energy. It was filled with rows of monitors, showing video feeds from all over the downtown area street corners, parks, even inside a few public buildings. Several people sat at workstations, wearing headsets and staring intently at screens. A man in his 40s with a close-shaven beard looked up from a bank of 4 monitors, each showing a different angle of the fountain incident. On the screens, Brickman was still standing there, adjusting his belt, looking smug. The girl walked over, water still darkening the shoulders of her shirt. She placed the damp sketchbook on the desk. "He took the bait," she said, her voice no longer quiet or young. It was firm, clear, and carried a natural authority that filled the space. The man with the beard, a seasoned detective, let out a low whistle. "And then some, Chief. He went for the full humiliation play. We got it all, the snatch, the pour, everything. Crystal clear audio, too." The girl, who was actually Chief Marissa Vance, the newly appointed head of the Crestview Police Department, nodded slowly. She unclipped a tiny, almost invisible microphone from the collar of her shirt. A delicate wire ran from it, hidden by her braids, to a small recorder in her pocket. She placed the equipment carefully on the desk, as if it were evidence. In a way, it was. "Let me see the wide shot again," she said, leaning over the detective's shoulder. He clicked the mouse, and the main monitor showed the entire square from a high angle. There she was, sitting peacefully. There was Brickman, storming over. They watched the entire interaction play out silently. Seeing it from above, detached, made it look even more jarring. The way he loomed over her, the casual theft of the water bottle, the cruel, deliberate motion of the pour, the way the crowd subtly recoiled. Chief Vance watched her own soaked form on the screen walk away. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were sharp, taking in every detail. He never identified himself properly, she noted quietly. Never stated a clear ordinance, just his own irritation. And he destroyed private property that tourists watered to commit the assault. Assault? A younger woman at the next workstation said, turning around. "You're pressing charges, Chief?" Vance straightened up, rubbing a hand over her damp neck. "That's not the primary goal. This was a stress test. A probe. We needed to see the rot in the daylight." She gestured at the frozen image of Brickman on the screen. He didn't see a person sitting at a fountain. He saw a target. An opportunity to flex power. That doesn't come from nowhere. It's a habit. She walked over to a whiteboard on the far wall. At the top it said, "Operation Clean Slate." Underneath were a few photos and names of officers, with question marks and notes. Brickman's name was already there, circled. "Flag everything connected to him," Vance said, turning back to her team. Her tone was calm, but left no room for debate. "I want every call he's ever responded to in the last 5 years. Every report he's filed. Every use of force incident, no matter how minor it was written up. Every citizen complaint, even the ones that were unfounded and filed away." She walked to a small locker in the corner, opened it, and pulled out a crisp, dry blouse. As she changed out of the wet shirt, she continued giving instructions. Look for patterns. Who were the subjects of his reports? What neighborhoods did he patrol most aggressively? Who were his frequent partners? This, she said, pointing a thumb back at the monitor, wasn't an isolated moment of a bad day. This was the fruit of a poisoned tree. We need to see the whole orchard. The detective with the beard, named Collins, started typing rapidly. "We'll run the analytics. Disparity in stop reports, complaint correlations. It'll take a few hours to compile." "Good," Vance said, buttoning the blouse. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of a monitor, fixing her braids. The young girl from the fountain was completely gone, replaced by a focused, determined leader. "And pull the personnel file. I want to see his record. Commendations, reprimands, the whole story." She sat down at her own desk, a simple one in the corner of the busy room. She opened the damp sketchbook. The pages were warped from the water, but the drawings were still clear. They weren't the doodles of a teenager. They were detailed sketches of city landmarks, faces of people in the square, quick studies of light and shadow. On one page was a remarkably accurate and unflattering sketch of Officer Brickman's scowling face, drawn just minutes before he approached her. She had been studying him as intently as he thought he was studying her. One of the younger techs brought her a cup of coffee. "Rough first field test, Chief." Vance took the coffee with a small, tired smile. "It was necessary. You can't fix what you won't see, and I needed to see it with my own eyes, not just read about it in a sanitized report." She sipped the coffee, her gaze drifting back to the main screen, where Collins was now pulling up Brickman's personnel photo. He felt so safe doing that, so sure there would be no consequences. That's the culture we have to change. For the next few hours, the room was quiet except for the sound of clicking keyboards and murmured conversations. Reports scrolled down screens. Maps of the city lit up with clusters of dots marking Brickman's patrol routes and incident responses. Slowly, a picture began to form on the whiteboard and in their minds. Collins finally swiveled his chair around. "Chief, you need to see this." Vance walked over. On his screen was a spreadsheet. "I started with the complaints," he said. 13 formal complaints over 10 years. All dismissed. But the subjects, look. He highlighted a column. 12 of the 13 are people of color. The one that isn't was a white homeless man. The language in his reports. Collins pulled up a document. It was an arrest narrative. The suspect was described as visibly agitated and culturally disrespectful of authority. "Vague," Vance murmured. "Subjective." "Exactly. And look at his partner history." He bounced around until about 7 years ago, when he was paired with Officer Graff. They've been together since. Graff has a similar complaint profile. "And here's the kicker," Collins said, pulling up a map. "When they work together, their use of force incidents are 40% higher than their solo shifts. They feed off each other." Chief Vance crossed her arms, staring at the data. It was exactly what she feared, what she had been hired to root out. It wasn't just one bad apple. It was a rotten branch on the tree. "So what's the play?" Collins asked. "We bring him in? Confront him with the video?" "Not yet," Vance said, her mind working. "He's scared of paperwork, not people. He's comfortable in the system he thinks he understands. So we start there. We make the system he's hidden in start to feel unstable." A slow smile spread on Collins's face. "We gaslight a bully. We audit a public servant," Vance corrected, but her eyes glinted. "Reassign Graff quietly. Flag Brickman's activity, so Internal Affairs gets a notification for any little thing. Have the patrol sergeant start questioning his report details. Make every log in, every call, feel just a little bit harder. Let him feel the ground shifting under his feet before he even knows there's an earthquake." She looked at the sketch of Brickman's face in her book, then at the frozen video of him smirking. "He poured that water to feel powerful. I want him to learn what real power looks like. It's not in a uniform or a badge. It's in the truth, and we're about to give him a whole flood of it." Officer Dale Brickman left the park feeling a familiar, grimy sense of satisfaction. He'd put someone in their place. The world had bent to his will, just a little. The memory of the water streaming over the girl's braids replayed in his mind, not with guilt, but as a proof of his own authority. He'd restored order. He finished his foot patrol, climbed into his squad car for the last hour of his shift, and cranked the AC up high, letting the cold air blow away the last of the heat and irritation. The next morning, he arrived at the precinct house feeling normal. The old brick building was the same. The smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner was the same. He nodded to a few guys by the lockers, changed into his uniform, and headed for the briefing room to get his patrol assignment for the day. His usual partner, a burly man with a permanent scowl named Graf, was already there, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. They'd been partners for 7 years. They understood each other. They didn't talk much about their personal lives, but they had a rhythm on the street. They watched each other's backs, and more importantly, they backed up each other's stories. Brickman slid into the seat beside him. Ready for another thrilling day babysitting the public? Graf muttered, not looking up from his phone. Just another day in paradise, Brickman replied. Leaning back, the patrol sergeant, a tired-looking man with a clipboard, started reading off the assignments. He got to their sector. Car 42. Officer Graf, you'll be with Officer Chun today. Brickman, you're solo in car 17. Brickman sat up straight. Graf looked over, his brow furrowed. Solo patrol wasn't unheard of, but it was unusual for their pair to be split without notice. Sergeant? Something up with the roster? Brickman asked, trying to sound casual. The sergeant didn't meet his eye. He just scanned his clipboard, just shuffling things around. Needs of the department. You got a problem with driving alone, Brickman? There was a slight edge to the question. A few other officers glanced over. No problem, Brickman said, his voice tight. Graf just shrugged. What can you do gesture, but he looked thoughtful. As they left the briefing room, Graf clapped him on the shoulder. Guess you get the peace and quiet today. Catch you later. But the silence in car 17 wasn't peaceful. It was loud with Brickman's own thoughts. Why the change? Had Graf complained about him? No, that didn't track. They were a team. Maybe the sergeant just had a bug up his butt. He pushed the thought aside. The shift was uneventful, which somehow made it worse. Every routine traffic stop felt longer. Every radio call felt like a test. He kept waiting for his partner to make a comment, to share the boring load, but the passenger seat was empty. He found himself talking to himself, just to break the quiet. When he got back to the station to file his end-of-shift reports, he ran into his first real wall. He logged into the computer system at his desk. A big red error box popped up on the screen. **** access restricted. For patrol narratives. USE Terminal 3. **** Terminal 3 was an old, slow computer crammed in a corner by the storage room, known for freezing and losing reports. Everyone hated it. He walked over, annoyed. The login was slow. The software took forever to load. When he finally started typing his simple report about a minor fender bender, the system froze twice. He had to start over. By the time he submitted it, he was simmering. The next day was the same. Solo patrol. Terminal 3. Graf was now partnered with a young, by-the-book officer, and he gave Brickman a wide berth, barely making eye contact. A cold little knot began to form in Brickman's stomach. Something was wrong, but he couldn't see what it was. On the third day, the call came. His desk phone rang, a sharp, jarring sound. It was the Internal Affairs Division. Officer Brickman? This is Lieutenant Daniels from IAD. We'd like to schedule a brief interview with you. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., regarding case file 1147. Just routine follow-up. The voice was polite, neutral. It was the most terrifying sound Brickman had ever heard. Case file 1147. He racked his brain. It took him a minute to place it. That was the Henderson thing, from over 2 years ago. A shoplifting call that got messy. The guy had resisted. There was a scuffle. The suspect ended up with a bruised face and a broken wrist. They'd ruled it a clean use of force. The suspect had a long record. It was done. Buried. Why was it unburied now? Yeah, sure. 2 p.m. I'll be there, he managed to say, his mouth dry. He hung up and looked around the busy squad room. Was it his imagination, or did people suddenly seem to be avoiding looking at him? The laughter from a group of officers by the coffee machine sounded forced. A captain walking by gave him a quick, unreadable nod and kept moving. Paranoia, once planted, grows fast. He started seeing meaning in everything. The way the dispatcher's voice seemed a little colder when giving him a call. The way the evidence clerk took an extra minute to find his signature on a form. The empty space around him in a locker room that seemed to grow wider each day. He sought out Graf after shift, cornering him near their cars in the parking garage. "What's going on, man?" Brickman asked, trying to sound like his old, confident self. "First they split us up. Now IAD is digging up the Henderson case. You hearing anything?" Graf shuffled his feet, looking at the oil-stained concrete. "I dunno, Dale. Things feel weird. My new partner, Shun, he's a real straight arrow. Asks a lot of questions. Like, why did you approach from that side? Was that command really necessary? Kinda gets in your head." He finally looked at Brickman, and his eyes were uneasy. "Just be careful tomorrow with IAD, okay? Dot your I's." "Careful about what?" Brickman pressed, frustration rising. "It was a clean call. We both said so." "Yeah," Graf said quietly. "We did." He didn't sound so sure anymore. He got in his car and drove away, leaving Brickman standing alone in the dim, echoing garage. The interview the next day was held in a small, airless room. Lieutenant Daniels was a thin man with glasses who never smiled. Another IAD officer, a woman with a calm face, sat silently taking notes. It started routine. They went over the old report, line by line. Then the questions changed. "In your narrative, you stated the suspect was aggressively posturing. Can you describe that posture in more detail? The use of the wristlock is recommended for compliant suspects. At what point did you determine the suspect was no longer compliant? The security camera footage from the store's entrance shows the suspect had his hands in his pockets when you first made contact. How does that align with your statement about threatening hand motions?" The questions were like tiny, precise taps from a hammer. Each one chipped away at the story he and Graf had built 2 years ago. They weren't yelling. They weren't accusing. They were just asking in quiet, reasonable voices for details he didn't have, because they hadn't happened exactly the way the report said. He stammered. He contradicted himself. He said, "I don't recall," more times than he could count. Sweat soaked through the underarms of his uniform shirt. Then, near the end, Lieutenant Daniels adjusted his glasses and asked a question that seemed to come from nowhere. "Officer Brickman, how would you describe your general approach to public interactions, specifically with non-compliant individuals?" The image of the girl at the fountain, water dripping from her chin, flashed in his mind so vividly he almost flinched. His mouth went dry. I uphold the law. I expect citizens to follow lawful orders." "And when they don't?" Daniels asked, his gaze steady. "Then I use the appropriate escalation as trained," Brickman said, the words feeling like sand in his mouth. Daniels just nodded slowly, making a note. "Thank you, officer. That will be all for now. We may have more questions." Brickman walked out of the room feeling hollow. The comfortable world he knew, the world where he was in control, where his word was taken as fact, where he and his partner backed each other without question, was crumbling. The ground beneath his feet wasn't just shifting. It was turning to quicksand, and he had no idea who was pushing him in or why. All he knew was that the cold dread was now a constant companion, sitting heavy in his chest, whispering that everything was about to fall apart. The week after the Internal Affairs interview was the longest of Dale Brickman's life. He moved through his days like a ghost in a uniform. The solo patrols continued, The silent treatment from his fellow officers felt complete now. It wasn't that they were openly hostile. It was worse. They were indifferent. They looked through him. The space around him in the locker room, in the briefing, felt like a bubble of cold air. He tried to act normal. He tried to crack a joke with the records clerk. She gave him a thin, brief smile and went back to her typing. He saw his old partner, Groff, laughing with Officer Chun by the coffee maker. When Brickman approached, the laughter died, and Graff found something urgent to look at. On his phone, every radio call made his heart jump. Every time the dispatcher said his unit number, he heard a hidden accusation in the static. He started second-guessing everything. He'd pull over a speeder, and instead of the old automatic confidence, he'd hesitate. Was his approach too aggressive? Was his tone too harsh? He'd find himself explaining the reason for the stop in excessive, careful detail, which only seemed to confuse the drivers. The system itself felt like it was conspiring against him. Terminal 3 was now his permanent, punishing station. One day, the entire system crashed as he was submitting a report, losing an hour of work. When he complained to the sergeant, the man just shrugged. Tech's been glitchy all over. Put in a work order. The work order, he knew, would vanish into the same void his confidence had. He stopped sleeping well. He'd lie in the dark, his mind racing. The Henderson case, the girl at the fountain, the cold, probing questions from IAD. They spun in a dizzy loop. He started checking the news on his phone, scanning for any story about police misconduct, any hint that an investigation was brewing. There was nothing. The silence from above was terrifying. Then, the email arrived. It landed in his department inbox with a soft ping on a Thursday evening, just as he was getting ready to log off. The subject line was blank. The sender was just Chief's Office. His blood went cold. He clicked it open. The message was short, written in formal, sterile language. Officer Brickman. ***. Please report to the office of the Chief of Police tomorrow. 9 o'clock hours. Attire. Full dress uniform. Executive Assistant. Chief's Office ***. No reason. No context. Just a summons. Full dress uniform. That wasn't for a commendation. You got commendations at ceremonies, with crowds. This was for a private meeting. Private meetings in the chief's office, in full dress, were for one of two things: a promotion you already knew about, or a disaster. He knew it wasn't a promotion. The night was a blur of dread. He laid out his dress uniform, the dark blue jacket with its shiny buttons, the perfectly pressed pants, the hat he almost never wore. It looked like a costume. He tried to eat dinner but couldn't. He called Graf, but the call went straight to voicemail. He thought about calling the union rep, but what would he say? ***, I got an email to see the chief? That wasn't a grievance. It was an order. His mind frantically tried to build a defense. The Henderson case, it had to be that. Okay, he could talk his way out of that. It was old. The evidence was shaky. He and Graf had been cleared. He rehearsed lines in his head. ***, it was a high-stress situation, Chief. The suspect had a violent history. We used the force necessary to effect the arrest." The words sounded hollow even in the quiet of his own kitchen. The image of the girl at the fountain tried to push its way in, but he shoved it down. That was nothing. A minor thing. A splash of water. No report filed. No complaint. It was irrelevant. This had to be about Henderson. It had to be. The next morning, he dressed with trembling hands. He fumbled with the clip of his tie. The metals on his chest felt like lead weights. In the mirror, he looked like a stranger pale, with dark circles under his eyes, swimming in the stiff, formal uniform. The drive to headquarters was a nightmare. Every red light felt personal. He parked in the underground garage and walked towards the private elevator that led to the executive suites. The air felt thinner up here. The carpets were thicker, silencing his footsteps. The walls were lined with pictures of former chiefs, stern men in old-fashioned uniforms, their eyes seeming to follow him. He stood before the door. It was a heavy, dark wood door with a simple polished plaque, Chief of Police. His mouth was dry as dust. He could hear the faint, muffled sound of a voice from inside. He wiped his sweating palms on his pants legs, took the deepest breath he could manage, and knocked. A firm, female voice called out, "Come in." He turned the handle and entered. The office was huge, and for a moment it seemed empty. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, lighting up the dust in the air and offering a sweeping view of the city he was supposed to protect. The chief's large, polished desk sat empty. The high-backed leather chair behind it was turned away, facing the windows, showing only the back of someone's head. "Officer Brickman reporting as ordered, ma'am," he said. His voice came out tight and too high. He cleared his throat, standing at a stiff parade rest just inside the door. The chair didn't move. The person in it was silent for a long, agonizing moment. He could see a hand resting on the arm of the chair. The fingers were long, steady. A woman's hand. Finally, the chair began to turn. Slowly, smoothly. Time seemed to stretch and warp. First, he saw the sharp, crisp line of the dress uniform shoulder, the gold braid of high rank. Then, the row of service medals. Then, the neat, dark braids, now coiled and pinned with severe precision beneath the cap. Then, the face. His brain short-circuited. It refused to connect the information. It was the face from the fountain. The same young, composed features. The same calm, observant eyes. But everything else was different. The eyes were no longer just calm. They were commanding. The young face was set in an expression of impassive authority. The water-drenched T-shirt was replaced by the impeccable, powerful uniform of the Chief of Police. Recognition hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The air left his lungs in a quiet, pathetic rush. His knees felt weak. The carefully rehearsed speeches about the Henderson case vaporized from his mind, leaving behind only a white noise scream. "You." He choked out. The word was a whisper, ripped from a place of pure animal shock. Chief Marissa Vance regarded him. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply looked at him, letting the silence do the work, letting him drown in the horrifying reality of his situation. He stared, his jaw slack. The dripping water. The stolen bottle. His sneering words. Public property isn't your personal bathtub. Every detail came rushing back, now seen in this terrifying new light. He hadn't been disciplining a disrespectful kid. He had been assaulting his boss. He had been pouring contempt on the very person who now held his career, his pension, his entire life in her hands. A dizzying wave of nausea washed over him. The room seemed to tilt. The medals on his chest weren't just heavy. They felt like they were burning him, branding him a fool. The uniform he'd put on, for authority, now felt like the clothes of a condemned man. He was standing before the girl from the fountain, and she was the Chief of Police. And he had poured water on her head. The pleading started before he could even form a coherent thought. It was a raw, instinctual sound. "Please," he whispered. The word hung in the sunlit, silent office. Please. It was barely more than a breath, the sound of a man watching the trapdoor open beneath his feet. Chief Vance let the silence stretch. She let him stand there in his full-dress uniform, a costume of authority that now looked utterly ridiculous. She watched the color drain completely from his face, leaving a sickly gray pallor. She saw his eyes dart from her face to her rank insignia and back again, as if hoping the image would change. When she finally spoke, Her voice was calm, clear, and it cut through the room like glass. "You poured water on a police chief, Officer Brickman." She paused, letting that simple, unbelievable fact settle. "But more importantly, you poured it on a citizen you were sworn to protect. You showed me exactly who you are when you think no one is watching, when you think there are no consequences." Brickman tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. He swallowed, his throat clicking. I didn't know. It was the heat. I was having a bad day." The excuses tumbled out, weak and practiced. "Stop," she said, the single word silencing him instantly. "You didn't know I was the chief. That's your defense? That you thought it was acceptable to treat an ordinary young woman that way?" She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting flat on the desk. "That's the heart of it, isn't it? You saw a young black girl in public space, and you saw an opportunity for a little show of power. To put someone you deemed beneath you in their place. That was a bad day for you. That was your normal." He shook his head, a frantic, jerky motion. "No, it's not like that. I'm not. I've never." 13 complaints, she stated, her tone shifting to something colder, analytical. She tapped a folder on her desk. He hadn't even noticed it. Over 10 years. All dismissed. All involving people of color or vulnerable individuals. Your report language is a study in bias. Culturally disrespectful, aggressively posturing, vague, subjective terms used to justify your aggression. She opened the folder. Your use of force incidents spike by 40% when you're with your preferred partner. You feed off each other's worst instincts. You built a little kingdom where your word was law and your judgment was never questioned. Each sentence was a hammer blow. She wasn't yelling. She was just reciting facts, and the facts were destroying him. "Operation Clean Slate," she continued. "My initiative. To find the rot within our own ranks. To see it with my own eyes, not just read the watered-down reports. You were on a list, officer. A list of officers whose patterns warranted a closer look. The fountain was a test. You failed it spectacularly. The full scope of his blindness crashed down on him. The solo patrols. The reassigned partner. The glitching computer. The I-Ed-D interview. It wasn't a series of unlucky coincidences. It was a deliberate, meticulous tightening of a vice. And he had walked right into it, arrogant and oblivious to the end. "Please," he said again, the word stronger now, fueled by a rising panic. "My family. I have kids. I've given 15 years to this department. It was one mistake." Chief Vance stood up. The movement was smooth, controlled. She walked around the desk, not to get closer to him, but to look out the window at her city. She spoke to the glass. It wasn't one mistake. It was 1,000 small choices, over 15 years, leading to that one moment. The moment you felt entitled to degrade a stranger for your own sense of control. She turned to look at him. You didn't see a person at that fountain. You only saw a target. The pleading starts now, but it's 20 years too late. She walked back to her desk and picked up a single sheet of paper. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay, pending the outcome of a criminal and internal investigation. You will surrender your badge, your service weapon, and your department identification before you leave this building. Criminal. The word echoed in the hollow space of his mind. This wasn't just about losing his job. This was about handcuffs. "A record? You're charging me?" He whispered, his voice cracking. "We are forwarding the evidence, the video, the audio, the witness statements from the tourists you didn't even notice to the district attorney's office. They will determine the charges: assault, theft, official misconduct." She placed the paper back on the desk. "Your union representative has been notified. You may speak with them on your way out. This was it. The end of everything. The pension he counted on. The respect he thought he had. The identity of being a cop, which was all he had left. It was being stripped away in this quiet, sunlit room by the girl from the fountain. A strange, desperate anger bubbled up through the fear. So this was a sting? You set me up? That's entrapment. For the first time, a flicker of true emotion crossed Chief Vance's face. It wasn't anger. It was disdain. Entrapment is when law enforcement induces someone to commit a crime they wouldn't otherwise commit. Did I induce you to be cruel? Did I force you to steal that water bottle? Did I make you pour it on a stranger's head? She took a step toward him, and he actually flinched. I gave you an opportunity, and you showed me and the entire city exactly who you are. You trapped yourself. The fight left him as suddenly as it came. He was just a man in an itchy uniform, standing in a pool of his own terrible choices. He looked down at his shiny shoes, unable to meet her gaze. You will be escorted from the building, she said, her voice final. You are not to contact any current members of the department unless through your legal or union representatives. This meeting is over. She pressed a button on her desk. A moment later, the door opened. Two stern-faced internal affairs officers stood there, a man and a woman. They didn't say a word. They just waited. Chief Vance returned to her chair and sat down. She didn't watch him leave. She picked up a pen and opened a different file, as if he had already ceased to exist. Brickman looked from the I.A.D. officers to the chief, who was now ignoring him completely. There was nothing left to say. No plea would reach her. No excuse would matter. The world had righted itself with a crushing finality, and he was on the wrong side of it. With trembling hands, he unpinned the badge from his chest. It felt cold. He placed it on the corner of her desk. It made a small, definitive click on the polished wood. He fumbled for his wallet, removed his department ID, and laid it next to the badge. He didn't have his service weapon. It was in his locker downstairs. They would get it. He turned, his movements slow and stiff, like an old man's. He walked toward the open door. The I.A.D. officers fell into step behind him. He didn't look back. The walk through the quiet, carpeted halls felt like a walk to the gallows. Officers in suits passed by, their eyes sliding away from him. The elevator ride down to the lobby was conducted in total silence. He was processed out with cold efficiency at the security desk, signing a form for his weapon. And then he was standing on the sun-drenched steps of police headquarters, in his full dress uniform with no badge. The city noise swirled around him, cars, buses, people talking on phones. Life went on. He was now outside of it, a spectator to the world he had once patrolled. He fumbled for his car keys, his fingers numb. The weight of the gold braid on his shoulders, meant to signify honor, now felt like the heaviest thing he had ever carried. He had thought the uniform made him powerful. He learned today, in the most brutal way possible, that real power wasn't in the cloth or the badge. It was in character. It was in the quiet, calm woman who had seen him for exactly what he was, and had held him accountable without ever raising her voice. He got into his personal car, a simple sedan. He sat there for a long time, not starting the engine, just staring at the steering wheel. He had to go home. He had to tell his family. He had to find a lawyer. But for now, he just sat in the shadow of the building that had been his life, finally understanding the cost of the cruelty he had once thought was free. The water he had poured had been cold, but the truth was colder, and it had drowned him completely.